Even the biggest animal lovers can still be shocked by some animals' behavior. This old dog approached a dying orphaned foal. You won't believe what happened next. But before we start, if you enjoy this story, please subscribe and like the video for more amazing stories. It was one of the most exciting times on the horse farm in Alabama. They were expecting a new arrival. Summer the mare was pregnant and her baby could be born soon. Claire, the owner of the farm, couldn't wait to see the new baby. All the animals on the farm are treated more like pets than farm animals, and Summer was one of Claire's favorites. The birth was easy and her foal, Buck, was healthy. Claire was there for the whole birth and Summer didn't struggle. She even got to see how quickly the foal stood up. For around a week, everything was going well. Summer was feeding Buck and looking after him as a new mother should. Every time that Claire and her dog, Rocky, went to the barn, Buck would be eating and acting exactly like a horse foal should. And Summer was doing great, but then things just fell apart. They had fed the horses and everything was perfect. But when Claire and Rocky got to the barn in the morning, something was seriously wrong with Summer. She had broken out in sweats and was shivering uncontrollably. She hadn't done any physical activities that could account for her condition, so Claire was immediately worried. Summer was healthy when they left her, and now she was really sick. In the corner of the stall, little Buck looked scared and a little lost. He didn't know what was going on with his mom. They called the vet, who gave her medicine, and for 2 days the horse fought to get better. She was even feeding her baby when she could. Claire helped out there too. She gave him some replacement milk when he needed it. They were at the stables all the time during those few days. But then, the third day, she knew that this was not a battle that they would win. Buck laid down in a corner and looked terribly sad. That was when something incredible happened. Rocky, the Australian cattle dog, stepped up. He had never really cared about the horses, but he must have known what was coming because he went to lay down next to Buck and licked him. Claire cried when she saw the empathy her dog was showing the foal, and then she cried when she examined the mare. Summer was not going to make it. She was in a lot of pain. They were going to be forced to euthanize the horse. It's never an easy decision to make, but when a horse has a baby that's only a few days old, it's even more heartbreaking, and it puts the life of the foal in danger too. They took the foal to another stall and Rocky went with him. It was gut-wrenching. From then on, Rocky had adopted the foal. But one day the dog approached the foal, and you won't believe what happened next. Rocky barked at Claire and the rest of the farm workers. He wanted to get their attention. When she went to check it out, Buck seemed fine. But Rocky was so insistent that she checked that turned out that he had a low-grade fever, and in the next few hours, it got worse. They wouldn't have realized that Buck was sick too, at least not so early if it wasn't for the dog. He was an orphaned foal, and now he was sick from the same bug his mother had. Was he going to die too? They hoped not. The mother was weak from giving birth, so she deteriorated very quickly. But the baby was very young. They started treating him right away for that first fever. Rocky was acting like this was his own baby. They hoped that they wouldn't break Rocky's heart in the end. The dog was already grieving his best friend. He had lost his best dog friend of many years, just a few weeks before that. Ever since, Rocky hadn't shown any interest in playing, and he had barely been eating. They had been worried about him for weeks. The foal gave him a new mission in life. If it didn't end well, then the poor dog was going to pay the price. Rocky had never slept outside in his life. He strictly slept inside in Claire's room, but when it was time to go to bed that night, he refused to leave the foal. Buck was orphaned and he was very sick. He wasn't going to leave his dying baby all on his own. Worried about the dog, Claire tried to get him to come inside, but he wouldn't do it. Claire couldn't even convince him to come inside for dinner. She had to bring it out to him. They all fought hard to get the foal back to health. They all desperately wanted a different outcome for him than his mother had. Claire went to check on them every few hours throughout the night. Finally, at around 4 a.m., he seemed to be doing better, and Claire could fall into an exhausted sleep. Then she was awoken suddenly by the sound of the dog barking. Walking outside, she was shocked. Rocky and Buck were playing outside the barn in the pasture. The foal was doing a lot better, but that wasn't the end of the dog and the foal's story. It was only just the beginning. Their friendship was going to go a long way. They were playing, and from that moment on, the foal started getting stronger. Rocky made sure of it. He would nudge the horse until he got up and started playing with him. They ran together in the pasture, and the foal got stronger. When he sat down and got ready for a nap, then Rocky would lie with him and lick him. It was really sweet to see, and the videos of the unlikely friendship has brought a smile to many people's faces. Buck couldn't just keep drinking milk, and he started feeding out of a bucket too. The horse began to thrive, and Claire knew that a lot of that was because of the dog taking care of the horse. Without his friendship, the horse might not have made it, and he would have even less of a chance of thriving. The relationship was special, but it made what would happen later even scarier and even more potentially tragic. Rocky stayed with Buck as much as possible. Normally, he would play with Claire all day and all over the farm, but since Buck was there, he spent just as much time playing in the pasture with the horse. He was like the father and the best friend of the horse, and he was the protector too, even though Rocky was a lot smaller than Buck. His protective instinct got him in a lot of trouble a while later. One day, Claire and her farm hands were all working all over the farm when something made them run to the pasture in front of Buck's barn. They heard terrible noises coming from the pasture. The dog was barking in a way that they had never heard him bark before. There was an urgency that made Claire's blood run cold. He was angry, but he sounded scared too. On the other hand, Buck was moaning too. The horse was normally very quiet and didn't vocalize much, but they could hear his screams from all over the farm. Everyone rushed to them as quickly as they could, and what they saw was terrifying. The dog was standing in front of the horse, protecting him. A large snake stood up in front of them both, challenging the animals. They could see how aggressive the snake was, and they had to tread before the humans could even react. The snake attacked them. He was going for Buck, but Rocky would not allow it. Rocky jumped in between them. This wasn't the first time that they had snakes on the farm. Normally, they avoided people and tried to get away as quickly as possible. If they did get too close and they became a danger, then the farm hands would catch them and take them to be released far away. This wasn't even the first time that Rocky had a showdown with a snake. Normally, the snake would take the easy way out and go away. Carlum didn't like hurting any animals, but there had been times when they found the dog with a snake he had already disposed of. There was a time when the dog was fast enough to destroy a snake in seconds. But now that he was getting older, he was just too slow to react quickly enough and avoid catastrophe. He was also not as focused as he usually would be. When he was facing a snake on his own, all his focus would have been on the snake in front of him and his next moves. But now he was trying to watch out for the horse, and he might even have seen the people running towards them. He was distracted, and this snake was really angry and aggressive. There was a lot of space for him to retreat, but he wasn't interested. It looked like they wanted the fight, and they could do nothing to stop him. As he lunged at Buck, Rocky jumped in the way and grabbed the snake. He shook him and threw him away from them. The snake was going all over the place, but he wasn't backing down either. He was aggressive and he was ready to fight. Then Rocky threw him and the people could get closer. Buck had been jumping up and down, and they had to calm him down and see where the snake went. They meant to grab him and release him in a field, but when they saw him, they realized that he was badly injured and they couldn't save him. But while the farm hands tried to deal with the snake, Claire turned back to her dog and horse, and her heart dropped. In the pasture was Buck standing over Rocky and trying to nudge him. Rocky wouldn't wake up. The horse tried getting him to stand. It was heartbreaking to see how desperately the horse was trying to convince his friend to wake up. Claire was terrified. Had Rocky died trying to protect his adopted baby? She rushed closer and was relieved to see that the dog was still breathing, but he was in bad shape. His leg had 2 wounds where the snake had bitten him. There was no time to spare. She had to get Rocky to the vet as quickly as possible before the venom had time to spread. She picked him up and placed him gently in her car, which was luckily close by. But Buck had other ideas. He didn't want them to take his friend away from him. He might not have realized that they were trying to help. The dog was a hero because it was the second time he saved Buck's life, and they all knew how strong the bond was between the dog and the horse. But there was no time to consider Buck's feelings in those moments. Every second could be the difference between saving or losing Rocky. One of the farm hands had to restrain the foal, allow Claire to drive away without his interference. The vet started treating Rocky as soon as they arrived. He was lucky to be bitten on the leg because there was more bone and less tissue, and not as much of the venom penetrated and went into the body. It also didn't spread as quickly. Claire got him to the vet within minutes of the fight, and that gave him a better chance, too. The vet started giving Rocky medicine right away and cut away some of the already damaged tissue. They wanted to make sure that he lived. They also wanted to help him keep his leg. And after that, all they could do was wait. They would clean the wound often and keep him on 4 medicine. But the dog would have to fight to get better. He was asleep, and they would keep him calm. But it was a waiting game. In the meantime, Rocky wasn't the only animal that Claire and her team had to worry about. Buck wasn't a happy horse either. He refused to eat, and he seemed very depressed. He didn't even want them petting him, and that was one of his favorite things. They tried to hand-feed him some of his favorite snacks like apples or carrots, but he wasn't interested. He wouldn't come out of his stall to play. The poor horse had only seen the shape his friend was in, and he probably thought that Claire took him away because they couldn't save him. Buck wouldn't survive on water for long. They hoped they could show him his friend before he started getting sick. But that would all depend on how well Rocky recovered. Would his leg become infected and septic? For a few days, he did seem very sick. There were even a few minutes that he stopped breathing. But slowly, the medicine started to work and he could come out of sedation a little bit at a time. When he was finally awake, the dog was very happy to see Claire, and he loved all the attention he was getting. His leg wound was still red, but there were no pieces of tissue that were dying. Instead, the wound seemed to be healing up nicely too. It was a massive relief to everyone who loved the dog. They just wished that Buck could know that his friend was doing better. The horse was still sulking terribly. As soon as the dog could stand on his own, he didn't want to be cooped up in a little enclosure indoors anymore. He wasn't used to being in the vet's office. Thinking of Buck and how anxious Rocky was there, the vet made a compromise. The dog could go home, as long as they could keep him quiet and not on his leg too much. His pain meds would make him groggy anyway, and he needed the rest. But that all flew out the door when they got to the farm. Claire wanted to walk around and open the door for the dog, but as soon as they stopped, he jumped out of the window and rushed to the barn. As soon as Buck saw the dog coming, he started to dance and get excited. He put his head down to the horse, who kept licking him. It wasn't clear who was happier to see each other, the horse or the dog, but all the people who were watching the happy reunion had tears in their eyes from the joy of it. They wanted to spend a lot of time with each other, but keeping in mind what the vet said, Claire made sure that Rocky came inside to sleep, and during the day, she put his bed out in the pasture under the trees. This time, it was the horse that laid down with him, cuddling him until he was fully healed. This special friendship had carried both of them through some of the hardest things in life. And now, they could both finally heal. What do you think about this story?
Rocky, a giant German shepherd, had taken to sleeping outside his booth in the snow. After 3 hours, his owner felt pressed to find out why. What he discovered inside was totally shocking. And before we start, if you enjoy this story, please subscribe and like the video for more amazing stories. Matthew was startled when the giant German shepherd growled at him. He'd raised Rocky from a puppy, and the two had always been best friends. He approached the dog's booth again, and the dog reacted in exactly the same way. He stepped between him and the kennel door, lifting his lip on one side, and growled softly, as if to warn Matthew not to come any closer. The snow crunched beneath Matthew's feet as he stepped to one side. The moment he did, Rocky quit growling. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. "What have you got in there?" Rocky wagged his tail and dropped his head. Then he walked over to Matthew to have his ears scratched. He thought the confrontation was over, so he stepped to his right and approached the kennel again. But as he did before, Rocky stepped in front of Matthew and took on a warning posture. Matthew shook his head. He'd never know what happens in a dog's head, best to leave it to sort itself out. Whatever was in the booth was clearly important to Rocky, so let him have his fun. While walking through the snow to the back door, Matthew decided to take a look again the following morning. All of this had started during the summer of the previous year. Matthew, a keen carpenter, had spent the last few weeks of fall building a spectacular kennel for Rocky. It had a porch and ample space inside for the dog to shelter from the snow, which Matthew expected to start falling in early December. And that's exactly how it happened. The temperature dropped, and the first snow fell. Rocky instinctively understood that the structure Matthew had built was for him, and in no time he had turned it into his personal fiefdom. Rocky had rearranged the blankets Matthew had laid out for him and ate his meals on his own porch when Matthew brought out the bowl in the mornings and evenings. In Matthew's opinion, Rocky was the most spoiled dog in the whole of Baltimore, perhaps even the United States. That evening, Matthew peeked through the drapes in his bedroom, and sure enough, Rocky was lying on the porch of his booth. His head rested on his front paws, but his ears were standing upright as if he were on guard. A light snow had been falling for about an hour, and Matthew peeked out one last time before he went to bed. Rocky was still on the porch of his kennel. It was freezing outside, but he hadn't moved. This was really odd. Shortly after sunrise, Matthew walked out to the booth again. The previous night's snow had added at least 2 inches to the white carpet that covered the entire property. Rocky jumped to his feet when he saw Matthew. But when Matthew tried to make his way past the dog to the entrance of the kennel, Rocky stepped in front of him again. Exactly like the day before. The German Shepherd looked at his master pleadingly, as if to say, "Please don't try again." As soon as Matthew would make a move toward the entrance of the booth, the lip would lift, and the soft growl would follow. The dog was doing exactly what he had done the day before. He was trying to keep Matthew from looking inside the kennel. Matthew was completely flabbergasted. He had no idea what to make of Rocky's outlandish behavior. But then he hatched a plan. He walked briskly through the snow to the kitchen door. Once inside, he took a slab of raw steak from the fridge and started chopping it into small cubes. This was Rocky's favorite treat. The dog wouldn't be able to resist a bowl of chopped steak. Of that, Matthew was sure. The only challenge would be to convince Rocky to come and eat it in the kitchen. With the bowl in hand, Matthew walked outside and over to the booth again. Like earlier, Rocky jumped up to greet him. Matthew went down on his haunches and made a fuss of the dog. Then he produced the bowl from behind his back and let Rocky smell it. The dog almost jumped out of his skin. Then got him quite as excited as a bowl of freshly chopped steak. But when Matthew walked away, bowl in hand and called for Rocky, the dog sat down. This was unusual. He normally got his treats at his booth. Now his owner wanted him to follow him to the kitchen. Rocky was torn. He looked over his shoulder at the booth and whined softly. Then, seemingly making up his mind that all would be well for the next few minutes while he wolfed down his treat, he bounded after Matthew. In the kitchen, Matthew was on his haunches again. The dog followed him inside and jumped around, his eyes fixed on the bowl of steak. Part 1 of Matthew's plan had come together to perfection. He placed the bowl on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen and made a fuss of the dog again. Rocky tucked in. He didn't try to get all the steak in his mouth at once like most other dogs would do. Instead, he seemed to savor every bite. This had always fascinated Matthew, the way this German Shepherd seemed to relish his food. Now it was time for phase 2 of his plan. Matthew got up slowly. He walked backward towards the door, keeping his eyes on the dog. Rocky paid him no attention. Matthew exited the kitchen and pulled the door shut behind him. Phew! Phase 2 was executed successfully. He started making his way over to the kennel. Inside the kitchen, Rocky had been alerted of the ruse the moment the kitchen door had closed behind Matthew. And he wasn't happy. Not at all. He barked twice and then seemed to understand Matthew had tricked him. Rocky scratched at the back door and whined urgently. When it was clear Matthew was ignoring him, he ran around into the lounge. The lounge had big windows and Rocky could see his booth from there. He saw Matthew walk over and ended up upsetting him even more. He barked louder and jumped up against the window. Matthew heard the commotion inside and looked over his shoulder at the house. There was Rocky, perched up against the lounge window with his front paws and looking at him resentfully. Matthew didn't like the fact that he'd had to lure the dog inside the house and close him up. It felt like he was betraying his best friend. Like it would somehow break the bond of trust that had established since Rocky was a puppy. But he simply had to see what Rocky was protecting inside his booth. And there was no way Rocky would allow him close. Desperate situations call for desperate measures. He decided and pressed on toward the booth. When he reached the kennel, Rocky became frantic. For a few seconds, Matthew was sure Rocky would break the glass and come streaking through the lounge window. And the dog wasn't barking anymore. It was now snarling and growling in a really agitated manner. The dog's anger seemed to grow as Matthew approached the entrance to the booth. Matthew got on his hands and knees and put his head through the opening. He hadn't built windows into the booth when he'd built it, so it was more than a little murky inside. He got a whiff of the typical doggy smell and tried to look around in the dim light. Then he reached out and took hold of the one corner of Rocky's blanket. When he pulled on it, he was greeted with a loud, fierce hiss. Matthew instinctively jumped back, his heart now beating in his throat. His first thought was a snake, but it would have to be a giant one to be able to hiss that loudly and aggressively. Besides, it was winter, and the chances of encountering a snake were almost nil. Carefully, slowly, and holding his forearm in front of him to protect himself in case the thing inside decided to attack, Matthew made another approach. Again, he took hold of the corner of the blanket. Then he slowly pulled it back. The hissing sound again. This time, louder and more aggressively. Hesitantly, Matthew pushed his head through the opening. He was completely vulnerable now, because his head and elbow couldn't fit through the opening at the same time. If something on the inside attacked him, he was completely defenseless. Curiosity got the better of him. Once his eyes shook off the glare and adjusted to the gloom inside, he spotted it. It was a raccoon. For a moment, Matthew was confused. By all standards, a raccoon would have simply fled, yet this one was standing its ground. Just like Rocky had done, it was defending something. Then Matthew saw it. First, he only spotted one kit or baby raccoon. Then he spotted a second in the folds of Rocky's blanket. Then a third and fourth. When he'd finished counting, he'd gotten up to 6. Matthew immediately understood. The mother raccoon had needed a safe spot to give birth when the late snow began to fall. And being the gentleman he was, Rocky had sacrificed his home for her. And then proceeded to offer guard services too, completely free of charge. Matthew couldn't help but smile at the realization. Rocky, the loyal and gentle giant, had made an incredible sacrifice for the mother raccoon and her kids. He had shared his space and had even become their protector, even against his own owner. As the days turned to weeks, Matthew decided to create a cozy shelter for the raccoon family nearby. He made a comfortable nest and ensured that a safe place to stay. Rocky, understanding the situation, took his kennel back but always kept a watchful eye on them. Always ready to stand guard until they were ready to go explore the world on their own. What do you think about this story?
When a house accidentally caught fire, the family dog had to think fast to save the baby's life. What happened next is truly shocking. Hello friend, if you enjoy this story, please subscribe and like the video for more amazing stories. Lillian and Stephen were a couple much like any other. They had many of the same passions and interests, which made them the perfect match. One of their shared passions was animals, and specifically dogs. That's why, not long after they moved in together, they bought a dog. It was a large boxer that they called Beanie. It might have started off small, but it soon grew and became very well built and strong. Beanie might have looked tough and like he'd win any fight he got into, but the truth was that he was the softest and most loving dog Stephen and Lillian could have ever hoped for. The dog became the first member in what was to become their new family, but he wasn't going to be the last. In the middle of March that year, Lillian discovered that she was pregnant. She and Stephen had not been planning on having a baby, but they welcomed the news with excitement. They couldn't wait to give Beanie a friend to grow up with. The pregnancy went smoothly, and in January of the next year, she gave birth to a happy and healthy young boy that they called Stuart. Both Stephen and Lillian turned out to be great, loving and wise parents, who would do anything for their little boy. Throughout the year, Stuart developed quickly and was soon sitting up and even crawling and trying to walk. And through it all, Beanie was there as his best friend and sidekick. In fact, the two never parted. Their friendship was cute and adorable, but it was also the thing that saved the boy from certain death less than a year later. It was their very first Christmas with Stuart, and Stephen and Lillian really wanted to make it special. They were going to spend the day together as a family, opening gifts, playing games and eating food. Sure, Stuart may still have been too young to truly appreciate it all, but it was still a special day, and a magical moment that would live on in the memories of Stephen and Lillian for the rest of their lives. Even Beanie was getting in on the action, wearing a Santa outfit that Lillian had bought online. The amount of gifts that people had bought Stuart was actually ridiculous, but no one could deny that it was a fantastic day. Beanie ran around playing with the wrapping paper, sending it flying in all directions as his family watched on and laughed. Eventually they all got hungry and had a wonderful homemade turkey dinner, topped off with champagne for Stephen and Lillian, fruit juice for Stuart, and a nice cooling bowl of water for Beanie, who had long since shrugged off the Santa outfit. After eating, Stephen picked Stuart up and placed him in his bed. It had been a long, busy, and exciting day for the little boy. At just less than a year old, he would have no doubt been absolutely shattered, so it came as no surprise that Stuart was fast asleep before Stephen even reached the bedroom door. His dad opened the window a little to let the stuffy air out and placed the baby inside his cart. As he left the room, Beanie came strolling in and immediately leapt up onto the bedside table and into Stuart's little bed. He curled up at his feet and fell to sleep too. Stephen smiled and walked away, leaving the door slightly ajar just in case the dog wanted to leave. Stephen went downstairs and helped Lillian tidy up before telling his wife that he was going to go and drop off a few gifts at his brother's house on the other side of town. Lillian kissed him goodbye and told him not to be long. She then went to the couch and laid down in front of the TV. Before too long, her eyes started getting heavy and she too drifted off to sleep. She didn't know that disaster was about to strike. Something potentially horrific was about to happen. While tidying the kitchen, neither Lillian nor Stephen had noticed one of the hobs on the oven was still on. A stray cloth had fallen onto the hob and started smoldering, before bursting into flames. Within moments, the fire had spread and much of the kitchen was in flames. It soon filled the room and reached the adjoining ones, burning all that was in its way. The fire really did spread quickly. There was plenty of wrapping paper and other flammable substances around the house, and it essentially burnt like a tinderbox, quickly and intensely. Smoke started to blow into the front room where Lillian was sleeping, and the thick black curtain soon awoke her. Immediately, she panicked and remembered that Stuart was upstairs in his crib. She jumped up and ran towards the stairs, shielding her nose and mouth from the smoke as she ran. But the intense fire had taken over the bottom of the stairs, and passing through it would have been impossible. The fire roared and Lillian had no choice but to flee from the house, terrified about whether Stuart was still alive or not. But what she didn't know was that as soon as Beanie the dog had smelled the smoke, he had leapt into action. Beanie had pushed the bedroom door closed to try to stop the smoke coming into the room and then leapt up at the window, shoving his head into the small open gap. Using his head, he had pushed it wide open. It had taken a lot of strength, but eventually Beanie had the window open wide enough for him to get through. Luckily, there was a roof not far below the window, and beyond that, soft bushes that he could jump into. Beanie had taken a big breath of cool night air and turned around, running back over to Stuart's cart. He had leapt in and grabbed the baby by the scruff of his pajamas, lifting him up with all of his might and slowly carrying him across the room. In only a matter of moments, the raging flames outside the bedroom door would burn through and set all the plastic toys on fire. So Beanie had lifted the crying baby up and kept hold of him as he climbed out of the window and lowered himself down to the bushes below as softly as he could. Both Stuart and Beanie got a few cuts and bruises, but their small injuries were preferable to remaining in the house and facing the fire. From the front of the house, Beanie could hear Lillian's frantic screaming, but the protective dog continued carrying Stuart down the garden and away from the fire. But that's when he did something shocking and completely unexpected. Still carrying the crying baby in his jaws, Beanie walked out into the middle of the road with him and laid him down directly in the line of where cars would come hurtling by. Why had he done such a thing? Well, it was actually quite a clever move on the dog's part. You see, he knew that the fire engine would come from that direction, and when it came it would see him and the baby in the road and stop and help them. It was a risky plan, but Beanie instinctively knew he had to protect and save Stuart, and just as if it had been planned, the sound of a distant fire truck quickly came closer and closer until it came roaring into view. Beanie nervously paced around a crying Stuart and hoped the fire truck would see them in the road. Thankfully it did, and it screeched to a halt. 2 firefighters jumped out of the cab to assist the dog and the baby while the rest of the crew ran to tackle the fire. By that point the house was a blazing shell and no one would have survived it. Thankfully though, save for minor injuries sustained during the escape, both Stuart and Beanie were absolutely fine. The firefighter carried the young boy around the side of the flaming house to his hysterical mother. Lillian was beside herself in fear that her baby boy was trapped in the house, as was Stephen, who had sped back as soon as he heard what was going on, but the look of relief on their faces when they saw their son was heartwarming. The firefighter explained that Beanie had saved the boy all by himself, and they immediately rushed to hug him in gratitude. The family would never be able to repay the dog for saving Stuart's life, but Beanie didn't mind. He was just happy that his family was happy, and that's what made him the cutest boy of all. Have you ever heard of such a heroic dog before? And what do you think about this story? Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more.